Castlevania is a series of horror-themed action platformers developed and published by Konami. This video is going to focus on the original Castlevania trilogy on the NES. I will be looking though at every permutation of the original Castlevania trilogy, and in my usual style I will be exhaustively digging into the context, the process, and all the reasons behind what made Castlevania come about. The story of Castlevania in general begins somewhere in the mid-1980s. Arcade publisher Konami are developing and publishing games for their MSX home computer, which was an extremely popular platform in Japan. Early Konami games like King's Valley from 1985 featured gameplay of an adventurer exploring a ruined tomb, collecting treasures and throwing daggers at undead monsters. And 1986's Nightmare Meiju Densetsu, or Demon Castle Legend, although clearly showing more of Konami's scrolling shooter DNA, features a dark fantasy setting with a courageous hero fighting ghosts and monsters in an evil castle on his quest to defeat the Lord of all monsters. We can see the roots of Castlevania here, but why Dracula? I've given this way more thought than I think I should have, but there just didn't seem to be a consensus for why Konami went with the classic Universal Monsters theme, and I think I've got it. The copyright for those 1930s Universal Monster films would have lapsed just as Castlevania would have been going into production. At the time, Japanese copyright law protected a company's intellectual property for 50 years after publication. This meant that Universal's Dracula, Frankenstein and Mummy films would have entered the public domain in the first few years of the 1980s. No doubt this is why there was a glut of classic horror-themed games in the early 80s. And so Castlevania took the spooky action gameplay of King's Valley and Nightmare and combined it with homage to these classic Universal monsters, with the intent of making players feel like they were taking part in a classic horror film. So there, I think we have the background. I think we have the context. So let's take a look at those games. The first game in the Castlevania series was released in Japan as Akumajo Dracula, or Demon's Castle Dracula. Akumajo Dracula was released in September 1986 on Nintendo's Famicom Disk System. The story, as given in the Japanese Famicom manual, is metal as fuck. Every 100 years, black magic grows much stronger, and Castle Dracula will be resurrected from the prayers of the evil-hearted. Out in the wilderness of Transylvania, in a ruined monastery, a black mass is being held. Heretics pour the blood of the living onto Count Dracula's corpse as black clouds cover the sky. Count Dracula is returned to the land of the living once again, and so Simon Belmont of Clan Belmont takes up his magical whip and he sets off alone to Dracula's castle. This story is completely absent in all versions released outside of Japan, which isn't exactly surprising. Blood sacrifices, satanic rituals. I mean, parents were still concerned that Dungeons and Dragons was a gateway drug for witchcraft, don't forget. And so the setup for the nanny state is way more simple. Armed with your magic whip, you must storm Dracula's castle and whip all manner of ghosts and goblins before taking on Count Dracula himself. That's actually it. The first level does a bang-up job of teaching you the core mechanics of the game very quickly. Whipping enemies kills them. That's pretty simple. Whipping lanterns and candlesticks will drop money, hearts and sub-weapons, the latter of which the player can use to level the odds against Dracula's minions. There are also upgrades to the whip which turn it into a chain and then eventually a glowing morning star. The sub-weapons range from a knife which is thrown in a straight line away from the player, an axe which moves in an upward arc, a cross-shaped boomerang, a magic stopwatch which freezes time for a short time, and holy water, which paralyzes enemies and also sets them on fire. The sub-weapons are powered by the hearts you collect. The castle itself is made up of 6 different areas with some 15 different enemy types, with a boss creature at the end of each area. The journey is a completely straightforward linear path from A to B. One thing that I found really surprising about this game is the levels are actually laid out exactly as the map shows, so you actually get to go left and right, up and down in different sections of the game. I actually think this is worth talking about because I think this is actually quite groundbreaking for the time, because most games of this period are just left to right affairs. It definitely makes the castle feel massive, and the movement around these areas, I think, feels really meaningful and really exploratory. Due to the technology of the time though, traversing these levels can be frustrating. Going up and down stairs for a start, this is really awkward and it can be a struggle. It doesn't make the game unplayable or anything, it's just something that points out the age of the game. It's not that big of a deal. Simon's jump can't be controlled in mid-air either, which is something that you're used to now. It's just that games games even older than this had already established that controlling jumps in mid-air does feel a lot better. Combine that with the knockback from enemies and the fact that falling down a level results in an instant death makes for a very frustrating combination of overlapping mechanics. Once you've played the game for a while and you get a handle on how this all feels, I don't think you really keep making the same mistakes for very long. Actually, this is one of the things I've grown to really like about this game. The first few times you play a new level, oh boy. But once you get used to the layout of the levels and the enemy patterns and how they all overlap with the whip and the sub-weapons, you can breeze whole sections of this game with no friction. That doesn't mean the game isn't unfairly punishing in certain parts. The Frankenstein boss in particular is a real difficulty spike. You might feel like giving up at this point. It is worth sticking with it though, man, because after this, the pace just goes up and up. The next level is a spooky dungeon complete with skeletons strung up in a torture chamber. In no short time at all, you're onto the big guy himself, and as soon as you've whipped Dracula's head off, his body bursts into bits and the day is saved. Roll credits. Konami actually banned their staff from being credited with their real names back in those days, and so there's no historical record of who actually did what. What we do know about the development structure of Konami in those days is that most of their games were made by 3 people: a programmer, a character designer, and somebody doing music. The programmer would act as the project lead and the game director. Moby Games lists Hitoshi Akamatsu as the director and Akihiko Nagata as producer and designer. Wikipedia goes on to credit Nobuhiro Matsuoka for programming and Noriyashi Tokaguchi for art, but I can find no corroboration for that anywhere. It is a real shame, in my opinion, that one of the biggest and longest running game series, full stop, has its origins so shrouded in mystery. The core Castlevania team would remain largely unchanged for the next 2 games, with the exception of a rotating music team, which was Konami's usual way of doing stuff back then. Oh, maybe this is where I can talk about the music actually. Probably the single most enduring thing about this game is the music. This was the first game that composer Kinuyo Yamashita ever worked on, and she knocked it out of the park on the first try. Sato Terishima also contributed significantly. The Vampire Killer theme specifically was all her, and I just hate the fact that these girls are not given the credit that they deserve for that iconic soundtrack. You probably didn't need me to tell you that Akamajo Dracula was a bona fide smash hit. Famitsu gave the game 34 out of 40 and it shifted about 600,000 copies in Japan. The game was so popular that it was ported to the North American NES the following year and to PAL regions the year after that. The Demon Castle name, however, was not deemed appropriate for the more delicate sensibilities of these regions. The Castlevania title was thought up by some Konami executive, but 1987's Castlevania on the NES was not technically the series' first debut outside of Japan. Konami had already developed an MSX version of Akamajo Dracula, and they released it alongside the Famicom version in Japan. Where this gets interesting though is the MSX version was already localized and released in Europe in 1987 under the name Vampire Killer. Europe was a much bigger market for computers, and so this made total sense to do. Vampire Killer, for what it's worth, is a really fun little game with enough differences from the original to justify giving it a go if you happen to be interested in 80s home computers. Also, the MSX isn't the only computer to get a port of Castlevania. What's pretty unique about this game, especially for a Nintendo game, is that Castlevania got a lot of home conversions for micros and home PCs. The Commodore 64 version is a surprisingly faithful port. The graphics aren't the worst on the C64, and the music is some passable renditions of the classic Castlevania themes. Neither one of them is really digging into the power of the C64's hardware though, specifically that legendary SID chip. The home computers of the 80s pretty much all universally supported just one button on the joystick, so jump is mapped to up and the sub-weapons are fired by long holding the fire button. If you can get over that, then this is a pretty decent adaptation. If this was the version of Castlevania you played as a kid instead of the NES version, I think you'd have come away pretty happy with yourself. The first thing to mention about the Amiga version of Castlevania is just how good this game looks. Massive sprites, tons of animation frames, hundreds of colours on screen. This was the kind of thing that made me covet an Amiga when I was 11. The second thing that the Amiga absolutely crushed was music. Pretty much every Amiga game had amazing music, and Castlevania is no different. I don't prefer the music from the Amiga version, but the developer is clearly digging into the strengths of the machine here. I'm not super keen on the art style of the redesigned enemies either, and unfortunately the game doesn't really play that well. It's a bit like the C64 version again. You can find better Amiga games from the same year, but this is definitely a unique game to have in your Amiga library. The same can be said for the DOS version of the game, but I think Castlevania is still a solid DOS release for 1990. Once you've got your MIDI device set up, the music is great. If you don't set that up, the PC speaker is abhorrent. The controls are good, definitely much better than the C64 and the Amiga, because for a start, you've just got more buttons that you can use. I would say the DOS version of Castlevania is probably the best non-Nintendo version of the game. Also, it has a CGA color mode, which is just so awfully implemented, I just can't help but love it, man. I think it's time to move on, let's get cracking with that sequel, because I know that's what you want to see. The year is 1987. Konami are loving the success that they've had with Castlevania, so obviously they want a follow-up. Akamatsu has said in the past the thing he loves most about vampires is their power to revive as many times as possible. So Castlevania 2, or Dracula 2 as it's called in Japan, is a direct sequel, set 7 years after the first game. As Simon landed the killing blow in the first game, Dracula cursed Simon. This curse has been slowly killing him, and once it does kill him, Dracula's spirit will be free to revive itself once again. The only way for Simon to prevent the curse from being fulfilled is to find all the parts of Dracula that we saw flying off in the first game, bring them all back together, and to kill the spirit of Dracula once and for all before he has power to manifest himself again. The first thing that I noticed about this game is the dramatic shift in tone. The visuals are way more atmospheric this time round. Simon's dressed in all black with these red armor pieces. Simon's Quest really digs a lot deeper into that vampire mythology this time round, and it really feels a lot more like a horror game. Helping with that atmosphere again is that music, and it is even better this time around. Satoru Terashima returned for this game, but the score was led by Kenichi Matsubara, who penned the now classic Bloody Tears. Akamatsu said that Simon's Quest was inspired by Nightmare 2 on the MSX, and this makes sense given the influence that I think the first Nightmare had on the first Castlevania. I also think King's Valley 2 also would have had a part to play in this. Not only is there this shift in tone, but Akamatsu did what any auteur would do in this situation, and he just goes wild for the sequel. Out goes the linear A to B game, in comes a non-linear, almost open world. The pieces of Dracula are held in 5 different mansions, and to reach them you need to get the right items or to have the right skills. Finding new sub-weapons and the dismembered parts of Dracula powers Simon up and lets you access new parts of the game which were previously locked off. Unlike the first game, upgrades to the base whip are now permanent, and Simon can carry all of the sub-weapons, which are then selected in a little drop-down menu, a bit like Zelda. Hearts still power your sub-weapons, but now they're also used for XP in the game's leveling system and also function as currency in the town shops. Once you've got all the way to Dracula, there's 3 endings depending on how quickly you completed the game. Released for the Famicom Disk System in 1987, North American NES in 88, and PAL regions in 1990, Simon's Quest shipped close to 1 million units. Famitsu weren't as favourable with their review of this, but everyone else at the time seemed to like this just as much as the first Castlevania. Konami absolutely did the right thing by shaking things up for the sequel here. Objectively, Simon's Quest does drop the ball a couple of times. I would be lying if I said it was perfect. There are some parts of the game where it is impossible to know what to do next without reading a guide, but get a guide. Maybe its reach did exceed its grasp, yeah fine, but this is exactly what a sequel should be. Push those boundaries, try new things, be risky. If you hadn't figured it out, I love this game. The good news here though is there's no ports, so I can just crack on by talking about the next game. Hooray! In 1988, Konami would go back to their arcade roots with Haunted Castle. The Attract screen shows Simon Belmont's wedding day being completely ruined by Dracula swooping down and scooping up his wife, I guess. It's a shame because this is probably the best looking game in this whole video. Lovely smooth animation, beautiful big sprites, cool creature designs, also great music. The reason it's a shame is because this game is just so punishingly hard on the basis that it just wants to extract money from kids. This would be a really fun game were it not for the fact that it's just designed to be hard for the sake of it. Right, this is it. This is the big one. Castlevania 3. Dracula's Curse. The core team behind the first 2 games were called in once again, with each department getting bolstered up with additional staff. With Simon's story having run its course in the previous 2 games, Castlevania 3 is a prequel. The story is about Simon's ancestor, Trevor Belmont, fighting Dracula some 200 years before the events of the first game. As usual, the Japanese manual gives us the best version of the story. Dracula used the dark arts to summon monsters from the spirit world to massacre the entire nation of Wallachia. The church dispatched a powerful army to Wallachia, but they never came back. In desperation, the Pope searched in all directions until he found a man with the outcast Belmont bloodline. That man was Ralph C. Belmont. Oh yeah, in Japan he's called Ralph. Anyway, there we are, that's it, that's the setup. This makes the story pretty much the same really as the first game, except now you're playing as Trevor Belmont. Also gone are nearly all of the changes made to the gameplay in Simon's Quest. Whip upgrades, sub-weapons, hearts and all that are exactly back to the way they were in the first game. This is now back to being a basic whip 'em up. There are some pretty major differences though, definitely worth talking about. One of these is branching paths through the game. So instead of it being a linear A to B map like it was in the first Castlevania, you can now choose your path through 10 or more different stages. You can't visit them all in one playthrough, and some paths are easier than others, so there is some replayability here. Some of these paths will lead Trevor to the next significant difference, and that is multiple playable characters. On certain stages, Trevor meets up with new characters who you can then choose to play as. The first one you meet is Grant the Pirate. He can change the direction of his jump in mid-air. At last! He can also climb up walls and ceilings, but this is hella finicky. The second character you meet depends entirely on the path you choose, because you can't meet all the characters in one playthrough. These are Cypher the Magic Monk and Dracula's emo son Alucard. Cypher uses magic spells as sub-weapons, and Alucard can turn into a bat. Although Alucard is the edgy boy that makes him super cool, Cypher is actually better to play as, and so I tend to choose her. Famitsu gave Castlevania 3 a 30 on release, and other mags were giving it around about your 80%. The game might not have shifted as many copies as Simon's Quest, but today Castlevania 3 is one of the all-time top-rated NES games. The story of Castlevania 3 would of course inspire the award-winning Netflix animated series written by award-winning writer Warren Ellis. Whether you've played the game or not, the animated series is sick, and it exists because this old game exists. And to me, that's pretty cool. Castlevania was Konami's top-selling franchise of the 80s, shifting around 3 million units all told. The whole Castlevania trilogy on the NES is a landmark series. A lot of the features laid down in these first games would end up being staples of the core Castlevania makeup. The non-linear format and the RPG elements introduced in Simon's Quest would go on to be a key part of the series and would even end up spawning a new genre. Konami have released and re-released these games a million times over the years. There's no way you can't find a way to play them. They were released on PC in 2002, on the GBA in 2004, they're all on the NES Mini, and they're all part of the Castlevania Anniversary Collection, which was released on Steam, Xbox, Switch and PlayStation 4. If you haven't played them, these are bona fide quality games, mate, and they are well worth playing today. That is it. That's the longest script I've ever written. I had a whale of a time making this. I had a whale of a time playing all these Castlevania games. I hope you enjoyed it. Let me know in the comments. Alright, thanks very much everybody. Cheers. Ta-da.